Okay, I had a student send in a great question about modeling with sinusoidal functions and the phase shift. The question was really more of a general one, and you'll have different situations, and you've got to write a sinusoidal function with either sine or cosine to model that situation. And the question was basically, how do you know whether to use sine or cosine? Um, and the reality is you can do either. If you think about it, cosine is just, or sine is just the other one shifted over pi over 2. Like if you were to shift over cosine by pi over 2, you'd end up landing right on sine and the graphs would look identical. So those two trig functions are just a phase shift away from each other. But in terms of what's easiest and what Khan's looking for is asking yourself, well, when they give me points, right? Is the first point that they give me, is that a maximum or is it on the midline? If it's a maximum, then cosine's easier to use because cosine, the basic cosine function starts at its maximum, right? At the normal cosine function at time 0, cosine's 1 or at its maximum, and sine is at its midpoint at t equals 0. Okay. Now I know. I think the directions on Khan kind of confuse that a little bit, and they make you think that whatever at time 0 the function is determines whether it is cosine or sine. But they say u is equal to 0, which really just is a fancy way of saying is if you look at the first point that is given when they're talking about the model, that's if it's a peak, then you use cosine. If it's at the midpoint or the midline, you call it sine. So, for example, this one here, we got a weight attached to a spring. It's thrown upwards while a stopwatch is started at t equals 0 seconds. Okay, the weight starts oscillating vertically in a periodic way that can be modeled by a trigonometric function. Okay, the weight reaches a maximum height of 12 centimeters at t 1.5 and falls to a minimum height of 4 centimeters before returning to a maximum height at 6.5. Well, I'm just looking at this first. This tells me all I need to know about whether to use cosine or not. It's a maximum height at t equals 1.5, which is the first t that they give us. Okay, so then I'm thinking cosine. Now, here's a separate situation. You might have a little trouble reading this. A pendulum is swinging, so this is a pendulum swing next to a wall. The distance from the bob of the pendulum to the wall varies. I guess it's swinging next to a wall and getting closer and further away. Varies in a periodic way that can be modeled by a trigonometric function. The model function has a period of 0.8 seconds, an amplitude of 6, a midline of h of 15 centimeters, and at time 0.2, the bob is at its midline moving towards the wall. Since they give me a point, right, their t is 0.2, and it's at the midline at that point, that lets me know I'm going to use sine on this problem. So I hope that helps. This is tricky. It really is.